This is episode 339 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is supported by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access special insider extras. Learn more at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Sam Jeremy, PhD candidate at the University of Leeds. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
You'd approach a link boy and you'd say, I want to get from A to B. I want to get from, from Cornhill to Cheapside or whatever it might be. Will you light the way? And you'd pay them whatever the going rate was, a penny or whatever. And they would light their torch.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In 1552, a lexicographer gave us the word noctivagation, which means walking around at night. The word itself was a legal term for Shakespeare's lifetime, used to describe someone that wandered around at night without any particular purpose. Vagrancy, on the whole, was frowned upon for Shakespeare's lifetime, but vagrancy at night was viewed with extreme suspicion. In fact, walking around at night illegitimately was so bad that in his play, King Lear, Shakespeare implies that the poster boy for nightwalkers is Satan himself. This negative understanding of nightwalkers gets confusing, though, when we consider Falstaff in Henry IV, and he's talking about walking from tavern to tavern at night with Bardolph and mentions it as fun. Certainly not anything they were worried about, and other period references from the 16th century talk about link boys, who were young boys paid to escort travelers at night while carrying a torch to light the way. What does all this mean about traveling at night in a city like London? Were there legitimate reasons to be out after dark? And what options were available for creating artificial light prior to the advent of the light bulb? Here today to answer these questions and introduce us to the concept of night walkers and night lights for Shakespeare's lifetime is our guest, Matthew Beaumont. Matthew Beaumont is a professor of English literature at University College London and a co-director of UCL's Urban Lab. He is the author of several books, including Night Walking, A Nocturnal History of London, and most recently, How We Walk, Franz Fenton, and the Politics of the Body. You can find out more about Matthew in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. Good to meet you.
Falstaff talks about walking from tavern to tavern at night with his companion Bardolph in Shakespeare's play Henry IV. Now, if night walking was, as Shakespeare implies in King Lear, considered an offensive and illegal behavior on par with the actions of Satan himself, we'll allow Shakespeare some dramatic license there, but still not something good to be doing. Why were Falstaff and Bardolph able to joke around about this going out at night instead of being concerned about doing something illicit?
It's a very good question. I think that the answer is that there are two kinds of walking at night, and Falstaff does one kind of walking and others do the other kind of walking. Falstaff is a relatively privileged walker at night. He has a certain freedom because of his social status and position. And for him, therefore, it is okay to carouse in the streets, to behave badly, to drink, to careen around, and and generally to celebrate an emergent nightlife, as it were. So when he's out with Bardolph, for example, he says to him, "Thou hast saved me 1,000 marks in links and torches, walking with thee in the night betwixt tavern and tavern." They're on a kind of pub crawl. That's what it's called in Britain. I don't know whether in the States it's called that. Probably not. But a pub crawl. That's what he's doing, and it's okay for him to do that because of his privileged social status. For the poor, it's quite unacceptable. It's the poor, it's the vagrant. I'm sure we'll come on to them in a bit more detail in a moment, who are criminalized by the activity of being in the city at night.
We do actually have this phrase here in the US, although I think we more often call it a bar crawl, because I think that's the parallel there. Yes. But yeah, we have this phrase here too. Tell us about the kinds of night walking that were considered illegal. Are you suggesting that it was more about your class than what you were actually doing as to whether or not it was unlawful?
Absolutely. It was very much about class. There's a late 17th century and 18th century distinction, which I think is really useful here, between noctambulance and noctivagants. And a noctambulant was someone who, perhaps a little bit like Falstaff and Hal, slightly earlier on in an earlier scene in Henry IV, are minions of the moon, as Shakespeare calls them. They have the freedom of the city at night because of their social status. They get to promenade and carouse, as I've said, around the city at night. They're squires of the knight's body, to use Shakespeare's wonderful phrase, where night is a play on night, KN and just NIGHT. So those are the noctambulants. Those are the socially comfortable, confident walkers at night. And then there's the noctivagants. And the noctivagants are vagrants. They are the poor. And they are those who, in contrast to the more privileged night walkers, are in breach of the curfew because they are regarded as criminal, because it is assumed that they are, at the very least, economic migrants from the countryside, and at the most, homeless and vagrant, and if they are women, prostitutes, common night walkers, as they were called. So, yeah, these night walkers have an important legal history, which perhaps it's very briefly worth saying something about. It goes all the way back to at least the late 13th century and to something called the Statute of Winchester, which Edward I introduced in 1285. A statute specifically targeting so-called common night walkers, anyone who broke the curfew in the city at night. And of course, that did exclude people like Falstaff, Hal, those who could afford to pay for people to carry torches for them, those who could travel by horse or by carriage. If you were on foot in the city at night and you didn't have a light with you, you were a vagrant, you were a common night walker, and you could be put into prison.
So if you were caught night walking, what was the punishment?
The punishment was to be held in one or other prison in London or whichever town or city you happen to be in. And probably the most interesting, colourful of those, I suppose, is one called the Tun. Newgate was a popular prison for common night walkers, but there's an even more interesting, because less well-known, prison purpose-built for the imprisonment, in effect, of common night walkers, called the Tun. So named after the cask of ale, because it was the building was the shape of a cask of ale. And that was dated from about 1282, 83, I think, and was located in Cornhill, in the centre of London, in the old city of London. And yeah, that was specifically a prison for night walkers and other suspicious persons, as it was said. There's a really interesting book by someone called James Howell from the mid-17th century, from 1657, I think, called Londonopolis, which is subtitled A Perlustration of the City of London, in which he says, and I can quote, he says, the night watchers to this city, and that means those who are policing the city at night, the night watchers to this city committed not only night walkers, but also other persons, as well spiritual as temporal, whom they suspected of incontinency, and punished them according to the customs of the city. Incontinency meant sexual incontinency. It meant behaving lewdly or badly. So those kinds of people were put into the Tun or into Newgate. They were sometimes humiliated, particularly if they were female common night walkers, in other words, prostitutes, as I say. So female common night walks were often led in a kind of procession to Aldgate, also in the city, with a hood of rayed cloth, and they were there put in a pillory. So humiliation, public shaming was part of the punishment of common night walkers.
In order for night walking to be illegal, you'd have to set parameters around what constitutes night, I suppose. And throughout the year, this time is going to vary because, of course, the Earth is moving closer to and further away from the sun, and the exact time is going to be different depending on the time of year. So, Matthew, you've mentioned that night walking was illegal, but how was the legal beginning of night established if nightfall was a moving target?
That's a very good question and quite a difficult question to answer, I think. So I won't be able to do so very precisely because, as you perhaps imply, historically, the definition of night shifts. It's not just that seasonally it shifts, that is absolutely the case. It's that historically definitions of the night evolve and change. So when the curfew is first introduced in England in 1068, I think it is, by William the Conqueror, so only a couple of years after the Norman invasion of England, he introduces this curfew. The word, incidentally, is derived from the Norman French couvre-feu, cover fire. So it was all about covering fires, putting out lights, minimizing the danger of fires happening or spreading from home to home. So the curfew takes place at dusk, which is, of course, different in the winter to in the summer. And at that point, bells ring out all over the city. The gates of the city, the medieval walled city, are closed. The wickets beside the gates are also closed. And there's quite a formal, official moment, as it were, when night could be said in a sort of legal sense to fall. But of course, the city developed beyond the boundaries of the medieval walled town, and nightlife began to become more and more important, in fact, in the everyday life of the city. And those two things meant that nighttime, as it were, got pushed back. So I think in the Middle Ages, it was probably about 8 o'clock in the winter and 9 o'clock in the summer that the curfew took place. That got pushed back to 9 o'clock in the winter, 10 o'clock in the summer, and so on and so forth until the curfew falls out of use at some point in the early modern period, and the city becomes much more sociable and indeed much harder to police as a result.
Earlier, you told us that the distinction for whether or not you are illegal when you're out night walking is whether or not you had a light with you. And Shakespeare lived well before the advent of electric lighting. So nobody was walking around with a flashlight, but they did have candles. And Samuel Pepys even mentions a lantern that would have been used to provide lighting after the sun had gone down and it was dark in the city. But that makes me wonder whether or not the streets of London ever provided any public artificial light, or what technologies were available for lighting the darkness before the advent of electricity?
Well, it wasn't until the late 17th century that public lighting really becomes a feature of the city, and that it's collectively organized, that it's organized by the city, as it were. So from the late 1660s, and I think it first comes from Paris, in fact, London starts to get, or at least certain central parts of London, Westminster in particular, Oxford Street, etc., get lit at night by oil lamps running along the streets. Before that, it was very much on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, and it was really only a privilege for the rich. Again, whether the rich were navigating their way through the streets of the city with servants who carried torches, or whether they were lighting the exteriors of their homes, their houses in Cheapside or wherever it might be. Because again, they would use servants to light oil lamps outside the buildings, and that would throw a bit of light on the street. In the vast majority of London, there was darkness. The poor couldn't afford to illuminate where they lived, and that actually goes on happening all the way up to I mean, at least the late 19th century, I'd say electricity is introduced in the very late 19th century, but long after the introduction of gaslight, which is the first sort of mass form of urban illumination in the early 19th century, long after that, slums and poorer areas are completely dark after nightfall if there isn't a moon.
What kind of torch are we talking about? Were they walking around holding, a lit candle, or was it like some bulrushes that had been lit on fire? What was the mechanics there of what we would expect them to be holding?
I think there were probably various kinds. There were sort of oil wicks were used by the rich. There were tallow candles. So all providing slightly different kinds of light. Some of them perhaps not very efficient, guttering a lot, smoky. So yeah, we mustn't think of the light as either even or particularly bright.
Earlier, you referenced servants that are walking around carrying the lights for the wealthy when they're trying to get from place to place at night. And I want to bring up the idea of a link boy for Shakespeare's lifetime. This expression referred to someone who was paid to carry a flaming torch to light the way for pedestrians at night. Matthew, tell us about how someone might hire a link boy and who was it that was employed to do this job? And then tell us also about whether or not houses were equipped for this travel. Like I've seen some artifacts of what's called a candle snuffer, but it's attached to the outside of a building, like next to a door where you'd expect a doorbell to be or something. So explain to us how this situation worked with using a link boy to get around at night.
Yeah, so a link boy was generally a relatively poor person, a child, who you could hire on the street, much as you'd hire someone in a rickshaw to take you from one place to another in a city in South Asia or something like that. So you'd approach a link boy and you'd say, I want to get from A to B. I want to get from from Cornhill to Cheapside or whatever it might be. Will you light the way? And you'd pay them whatever the going rate was, a penny or whatever, and they would light their torch. And they would take you through streets that, let's remember, were pretty treacherous. They weren't paved at this point. It wasn't again until the late 17th century, around the time that public lighting was first introduced, that streets were really properly paved. The paved city is the 18th century. Before that, it's muddy. There is probably bits of broken paving. There are great ruts from the wheeled carriages and coaches and carts that are going through the city, and there's a potentially dangerous crowd of people in the streets of the city at night. So it was pretty crucial, I think, but it was again a social privilege. Not everyone could afford to have their way lit in the streets. Once they'd taken you home, the link boy would, probably quite possibly extinguish their own torch outside the house, or a servant, if you were sufficiently privileged, would come out and light or trim the wick on the lamp outside the house. So yeah, that's roughly how it worked.
You referenced that there's potentially dangerous crowd of people in the city at night, and I'm surprised by this. So walk us through what it would look like. If we were to arrive in London in the 1590s after sunset, it was night outside, what would we expect to see and hear? Was the city awake and bustling? Was there a nightlife, shops open, places you could buy things that you could do? Or would it have been quiet and the stores are closed up? Of particular interest here to me is whether or not there would have been any nighttime plays at places like the Globe, for example.
Lots of interesting questions there. The important thing to remember, I suppose, is that the period in which Shakespeare was living was very much transitional in terms of the city's nightlife. So it was really Henry VIII who pioneered the nocturnal entertainment as a court activity, but those were relatively formal events. They were formal rituals of one kind or another, including masks and that kind of thing, balls. And it was really in the later period in Shakespeare's time that culture, which had been a court culture, begins to spread and diffuse itself through the city. So, gambling and socializing and going from tavern to tavern, as Falstaff does, for example, becomes more and more a part of the nocturnal activities of the city. And certainly there are places in London which would have been quite dense with people. Bits of Westminster, bits of the city. Other areas, of course, would have been very, very quiet. I suppose the other thing briefly to mention is that human beings coexisted in this period with animals in a way that's almost unimaginable for us. So that it's not just about other people on the streets, it's about other animals, it's about creatures, it's about farm animals, it's about birds of prey, kites, for example, picking the bones or the offal from the streets after the market had closed up at the end of the day. So there is really quite a rich ecosystem, I think, in the evening and at night, tailing off, of course, as the night gets deeper. Up until the dead night, so called, the early hours of the morning, as we'd think of them now. The Globe and Shakespeare's plays are interesting, of course, because they didn't take place in the evening. We go to the theatre in the evenings generally, rather than to matinees, which are rather less popular because of our working lives these days. But in Shakespeare's time, the plays were put on in the afternoon. It was in the afternoon that the Globe, the Blackfriars Theatre, were hosting their plays. The actors would do their rehearsals and hurriedly learn their lines. They might have probably only just got the script of the play that they were about to perform, and they would hurriedly rehearse and hurriedly learn their lines in the morning. The play would be on in the afternoon, and then by 6 o'clock in the evening, the actors would disappear off to the pub. Frankly, they'd go to the tavern and have a nice night.
I know we would love to learn more about this topic and to explore nightlife in London for Shakespeare's lifetime. What are some of your favorite books and resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
Well, if it's not too vain, one of the books I'd recommend is my book called Nightwalking, A Nocturnal History of London. I mean, I'm not making any great claims for it, but there's plenty of material in there, and there's a chapter on Shakespeare and some of his contemporaries. I think Peter Ackroyd's so-called biography of London from 2000, I think it was published, is a terrifically rich resource. It's hugely panoramic. It's by no means just focused on the early modern period, of course, but it's really replete with information about the city, and includes some fascinating stuff about the night. I'd also recommend, and I think you can get it available fairly easily online, an early 17th century text. I think it's from 1608, and that's one of Thomas Dekker's, contemporary, of course, of Shakespeare's, one of Thomas Dekker's, not his plays, but a pamphlet called Lanthorn and Candlelight, in which he has all sorts of fascinating anecdotes about London at night. It takes the reader into the night, purportedly showing them, of course, what the dangers of the night are. Satan appears as a night walker, if you like, but actually, of course, really relishing being titillated by all the stuff that's going on in the city at night, the corruption and the carousing and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's fascinating. We will link to these resources in the show notes for today's episode so that you can check those out further. Now I'm just incredibly curious whether or not the references in King Lear to the connection between night walking and Satan was a nod to Dekker by Shakespeare, but now I can't remember exactly when King Lear was published, so I don't know if that lines up or not, but that's pinging in my head. But we'll put more notes on all these things so you can chase down that question and learn more, and certainly check out Matthew Beaumont's book, because it's a fascinating look at the nocturnal history of London. So we'll link that in the show notes for today as well. Matthew, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yeah, I've gratefully received the works of Shakespeare and the Bible, or we are also allowed the Quran, incidentally, in Britain. It's not completely kind of Christocentric in that respect, or Judeo-centric. The third one that I would request kindly of you, Cassidy, is the complete Oxford English Dictionary. And I happen to have at home. It's an old edition, but it's called the Compact OED, and it is a vast book where all 28 volumes or whatever it is of the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the finest, richest, most beautiful etymological dictionary that's around, I think, is compacted into a single volume between two covers. And my edition comes with a magnifying glass so that you can see, because this print is unbelievably small. You need a magnifying glass to see it. And the magnifying glasses, it seemed to me, would be extremely useful on a desert island, actually, because it would allow you to light a fire. So
smart
light
choice.
a fire.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
dual purpose selection there. I like it.
Exactly.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, something not a million miles from this, actually, in that I'm writing a book called London, a Writer's City for Cambridge University Press, and I'm making slightly slow progress with it at the moment. Currently writing a chapter on the River Thames. But yeah, that's my project and probably will be for the next year or two, at least, I suspect.
Oh, that's fun history, looking into the River Thames. We will look forward to seeing what you uncover, because I know it'll be just as exciting as your work on night walking. Thank you so much, Matthew Beaumont, for being here this week and taking us through the history of what it was like to walk around at night during Shakespeare's lifetime and explore the history of link boys and candles and all sorts of things. It's really been fun looking at this history with you, and I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Thanks so much, Cassidy, for your fascinating questions and for the invitation.
As always, we've compiled a list of resources and recommendations that we've been talking about in our show today into a list that we post in the show notes for today's episode. That's also the place you can find out more about our guest and links to their work that they're joining us to talk about today. And you can find all of this available at CassidyCash.com/episode 339. If you would like to see even more in-depth visual history related to our show today, including pictures of these link boys, a copy of the primary document that Thomas Dekker wrote, and several of these other references to night walking and court cases involved there, including that 1552 reference to noctivagation, just to see how it's spelled, if nothing else. You can access all of these extras inside what we call our detailed show notes. These are available for patrons of That Shakespeare Life, and you can access them right on the regular show notes page by using the Become a Patron button. That button allows you to either sign up to support our show, or you can log in using your Patreon credentials if you're already a supporter of That Shakespeare Life. And all of the bonus content related to today's episode and all of our episodes here at the show will expand right there on the website. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 339. That's CassidyCash.com/EP339. That Shakespeare Life is completely free to listen here each week, and that is made possible by our patrons. Patrons get access to our library of bonus content, like our detailed show notes, but they also get access to our video streaming library, including documentary plays, animated versions of Shakespeare's plays, and virtual tours, where we look at historic sites related to Shakespeare's lifetime, and it's all available on our Patreon page. Each week, patrons drive the work we do here with insider access to the making of our show and the opportunity to submit questions they'd like to hear in an interview. If you love learning history here with us each week and you'd like to power our work, consider becoming a patron today. Learn more and sign up right now at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.